Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Baulch, and this week our guest is Terri Kelleher, the Victorian President of the Australian Family Association. Welcome.
Thank you, Gavin. Pleasure to be here.
Good. Well, I thought I might start the discussion from a little kind of left field. I was looking up some research that came out of Arlington, Virginia, and it's research on the high suicide rate amongst American returned soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're using really quite a new language to approach what they think is the core issue, and this is the phrase they use. It is the moral core of an individual that's being damaged or stripped away. Now, how does that sort of language apply to where you come from?
Well, in the context of life issues, I think they're talking about, the damage to the moral core, if you like, because of war. And I think we are actually in a battleground. I think we have got a war for a culture of life. And I do think in relation to the life issues, both abortion, euthanasia, not choosing life at any stage, that it has damaged the moral core of our society and also the moral core of, the individuals that make up that society. Okay,
now, what age group of individuals are you thinking of focusing on today?
Well, I'm thinking of focusing on teenagers and young people, specifically school age, but not just school age, because what I would like to mention actually goes beyond school. It's the formation of attitudes. In particular, I wanted to sort of put out there, and this may come out of left field for viewers as well, the idea of the link between sex education as it's presented in our schools and abortion. So we're looking at young people, and my position, after looking quite closely at what materials are being used in the schools for sex education, I think young people are being sexualised or even groomed for sexual experimentation and to have expectations that they have a right to sexual expression. And that would be all very fine, except I think for young people we'd always accept it should be with guidance. When you look for the guidance there, that's where I become very concerned. The messages that are sent to young people, and then what guidance they are given, what context within they should exercise their freedom of expression, of sexual expression.
Well, now that's interesting. I was doing some reading, and some research was done on those serving time in American prisons who had crossed this line and had become and caught as a predator sexually on underaged young girls. And a question was put to them, so how much time did you spend grooming these young teenage girls? And their response was, right across the board, oh, we didn't have to do any grooming, society had done it for them. Would you like to comment to that?
Well, that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that research, but now you've put it to me. I think, well, yes, and I think the sexuality education is a big part of that grooming. I do see it as grooming to expect and think that sexual expression, without the guidelines, without the parameters that keep us safe, I think it certainly is a type of grooming, yes.
Well, let's unpackage this a little bit. So what would you like to say to our audience?
Well, I'd like to, they may be thinking, what's this got to do with abortion, for example, but specifically it is, because I know that abortion is, the big moral issue at present. Euthanasia is too, but at present we have avoided any euthanasia legalisation. So looking at abortion, now there's research come out from the Family Research Council in America, very recent research, as at December last year, on the demographics of women seeking abortions. Now, this was an analysis of data from the US federal government National Survey of Family Growth. It found a number of interesting points. One, women who have had multiple sex partners have a markedly higher rate of abortion. 2, abortion is more common among girls who become sexually active at an early age, say between 12, 14 years. 3, almost 3/4 of abortions are to women who initiated sexual activity before the age of 16. And 4, 40% of women who begin sexual intercourse very early, that is 12, 13, 14, will have abortions. Now, I'm not saying, what I'm trying to establish is the correlation between young people and what their sexual activity and abortion. And definitely it does appear that young people who begin sexual activity earlier and have multiple partners are more likely, statistically significantly more likely to have an abortion. Now, if we look at the reasons for that and why I associate it with sex education, is because the younger a girl begins having sex, the more likely she has multiple sexual partners. It's just in the nature of it. The more acts of sexual intercourse too that a girl has, the more likelihood she will fall pregnant. Therefore, you can see the development towards, well, therefore, it of course is understandable she would be more likely to seek an abortion. Now, you might say, all right, well, what's the causation between sex education and early sexual initiation? So I could say a few words on that because I think that there is a relationship.
All right, now let's take the word grooming for a moment, of which we're starting to unpackage. I've heard comments from secondary schools that one of the hidden agendas when you have a coming out at end of year graduation, the young man buys the corsage, he pays for the limousine, and there seems to be an expectation, the girls will tell you, that in that limousine probably she will be put in a very compromising position because he has paid for this service, therefore he wants a sexual favour in return. Now, is this grooming from our social networks and advertising and education?
Well, I certainly think the sex education they get in the schools would say no, and certainly in the materials they talk about, you will know what you want to do, what sex act you wish to indulge in, who you want to have sex with, when you are ready to begin having sex. But, there's no guidance there. Well, in what circumstances is it all right to have sex? Well, as adults, we would say, well, when you've got someone who's committed to you, not the boy who's accompanying you, to the school dance or the end of year school celebration. Well, but I think it builds up an expectation that they have a right to sexual expression. So then you get what young people may not understand, the pressure on them because they've built up this expectation. So if the girl's going to say no to the boy, he's going to say, oh, you wouldn't like to, have sex with me. How is she going to answer? And that's the only reason they're given for not indulging in sexual activity is, well, you wouldn't like to.
Yes.
In other words, I'm really trying to say there's no moral parameters, no moral context in which, well, this is behaviour that's not right because it may hurt someone.
Thank you, Terri. We're going to a break now. You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and our guest is Terri Kelleher. Terri, I was interested in you raising the fact that there seems to be some correlation between the sex education, grooming, and abortion.
Yes, and that may seem unusual, but I'm not saying that abortion is promoted in sex education as a method of contraception, but I'm saying that the main messages that are sent, in fact, create a situation where young people are more likely to engage in sexual activity at an earlier age. So if I could talk about the main messages being sent by sex education. We had an American psychiatrist and medical doctor, Dr. Miriam Grossman from New York, who spoke a couple of years ago here in Australia. She has spoken before the UK House of Lords, she's spoken before the United Nations, before the American Congress, specifically on this issue of sex education, and she says that it doesn't give young people the truth. It doesn't give them all the medical facts that they need to know, for example. Now, my contention is that it does set young people up to have expectations that they have a right to sexual behaviour. Now, Miriam Grossman pointed out the main messages, and looking at our resources here in Victoria for sex education, I can see them all replicated or borne out. Miriam Grossman said, first of all, the message is that young people, saying to young people, you can decide when you are ready for sexual activity, discuss it with your partner. So you might have a 13-year-old talking to her 14-year-old boyfriend, are we ready to begin sexual activity? You can decide what sexual act you want to do. And they provide glossaries in the materials of different sex acts. And there's no moral context, number one, nor is there any grading of those acts as to their health implications for sexually transmitted infections. Exploration of sexual feelings, it's right to do what feels good. That's a message that's definitely sent. Sexually transmitted infections, unplanned pregnancy, emotional distress from casual sex, well, they're treated fairly lightly. Certainly the sexually transmitted infections are, about a course of antibiotics and that will clear it up. But that doesn't deal with the impact of actually being diagnosed with a sexually transmitted infection, nor does it tell the truth that you have, if it's a virus, you have it for life, and it will come back and become live at certain times of your life, and that it can affect your fertility. So if they do downplay it. And also young people are given the impression that casual sexual encounters with no emotional commitment is okay. Now, she says medically, scientifically, that is not the case. That neuroscience is showing, or medical science shows, that in intimate behaviour, that might only be touching, caressing, hugging, that the hormone oxytocin is released. Now, that's what's called, it has a number of functions, oxytocin. One of the functions is that it's called the bonding hormone. It lowers caution, and it builds trust. It's saying, go ahead and do it. This feels very good. It also depresses the executive function of the brain. So you're not thinking about sort of the medium or longer term consequences. You're just feeling about how good it feels. Now, this for young women is more serious than for young males because the female hormone estrogen actually ramps up the effect of the oxytocin. So if you've got a boy and a girl who are touching and caressing, and they're in that situation, the girl is much more likely to be very, very bonded towards the boy and to feel these feelings of very warm feelings towards him and to lower her caution as to what the consequences could be for her. Now, boys too produce oxytocin. However, the testosterone actually dampens down the operation of the oxytocin.
So, Terri, what you're alluding to here is that young women, young teenagers, girls, are at greater risk of compromising their moral position?
Well, they're at greater risk of serious emotional distress over casual sex. That's not to say that boys can't be distressed too at a lack of emotional attachment, but girls are more likely to find themselves, and they may be surprised, that they actually want an attachment to the boy with whom they've been intimate and can't understand why he keeps putting them off. Miriam Grossman actually described it in her address because she worked on university campuses in the US, which is why she's now taken up a worldwide crusade on this sex education issue, because she saw where a lot of this was coming from was the misinformation. And young girls would come to her and say, oh, I'm waiting for him to ring me, or, he won't answer the calls, or why aren't I important to him? What's wrong with me? And she would say, there's nothing wrong with you. This is the way you are wired. It affects young women more than men. So if you can understand the girl in the back of the limousine, to go back to your example, then the effect of the oxytocin, is to make her feel that she can trust the boy, perhaps, and perhaps to, depress her, what might be her more natural caution if she were thinking clearly about it.
Well, thank you, Terri. I think as young teenagers and parents, we've got something to think about. You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and our guest today is Terri Kelleher. Terri, the information that you're sharing, it's something that our young people seem to be lacking, and I think the parents as well were, let's say, not so much misinformed, but not informed well enough. What would you say to the parent?
Well, I would say to have a look at the material that's being used. Think about the messages, for example, about the way in which young people are, what they're told about sexually transmitted infections. If you go to the Family Planning Victoria website, their leaflets on sexually transmitted infections I know are recommended for use in Victorian schools, and I think they are used in particular to tell young people. But if you have a look, the way in which they're treated, I think, would give young people, adults might have a different view, so you could actually go with your teenager, your son or daughter, and have a look at the way that they treat them. I'd like to just perhaps read to you some of the things that they say. They certainly give the impression that, well, if you are diagnosed with chlamydia or gonorrhea, that, well, a course of antibiotics, will clear it up. But of course we know as adults that's not the end of it, that in fact they're very serious infections. They could be lifelong, and you would have to manage them. It could have implications for fertility in young girls, later on, that it would affect their fertility. I think that a little more guidance needs to be given in these matters for young people. Another website is likeitis.org.au. That's Amari Stopes' website, and they too have the same sort of approach to the diagnosis of sexually transmitted infections. So that's just one way in which the medical information is not complete. The herpes virus, the statement actually is, if you look at Family Planning Victoria, that, well, you can almost expect that you'll get herpes if you are sexually active. It's just what you can expect. Whereas tell the young person the truth. Well, it's because if you have multiple sex partners, you are very likely to contract the herpes virus. But not if you only have sex with the one person to whom you're committed. So I think that it's incomplete. And I think parents, I would advise them to go and have a look at those websites. Have a look at the Victorian Government, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. If you go on their website, their sexuality education materials for secondary are called Catching On. And have a look and just see what the approach is, the general approach, and think about whether you would take that approach with your teenager or whether perhaps they might misunderstand. And it's certainly empowering them. That's the very worrying thing, empowering young people to look for guidance to each other, and they don't necessarily have the life experience to do that. And it's also, for those who have a religious belief, very concerning because it's not put in any moral context that you can explore your sexuality and no one has the right to judge you. These are the messages they're giving to them without guidance as to how you actually, how you exercise your right to a sexual expression.
I had looked up just how a condom is made and what it's made from, and that material under a microscope has a kind of a weave to it, and it allows many of the sexually transmitted diseases just to pass straight through. So are we selling an unsafe product, or at least informing our young people incorrectly?
Oh yes, again, not full information. Not giving them all the information they would need to be able to decide whether they are willing to take the risk. Yes, you are right, condoms are really very heavily promoted. And of course, condoms, apart from the fact that viruses do penetrate condoms, there is also the leakage and spillage and breakage rate, on which research has been done, but they don't give that to young people.
It's interesting, isn't it? We live in an age where information is readily available if we go looking for it. Perhaps we need to encourage our young people to think and research for themselves and to become, what should we say, media savvy, that if in fact there is grooming going on and they're subconsciously submitting to activity that deep down they may have said no to, whereas now they're saying yes to. Well, it places the child and the parent in a very interesting place now.
I think it's overwhelming for young people. I mean, there's so much information out there. What I think is lacking is the guidance of responsible adults. And it's irresponsible not to give the full medical and scientific background. For example, what I was talking to you about the operation of oxytocin, and how young girls are even more vulnerable than boys in casual sexual encounters to, experience huge emotional distress. And that is pertinent to abortion, because when a young girl becomes pregnant, because she thinks that she can exercise her sexual freedom, yes, okay, that's fine, and therefore begins having sex earlier than would be perhaps preferable, and therefore there are more acts of intercourse. She becomes pregnant, it's not planned. Can you imagine the distress? And that's part of what also pushes down the road to abortion, which is why I'm raising it. Because I think when any girl or woman becomes pregnant and it's not planned and it raises challenges, they might be financial, they might be relationship challenges, I think there's panic that sets in. And I think that's where the girl or woman needs guidance and support. Otherwise, there's no choice in that decision to have an abortion. Because if you only feel you have one choice, I'm pregnant, I want to be not pregnant, and the only choice is to have an abortion, rather than there being someone there to support you while you actually de-escalate the panic and begin to think through, well, do I have options and what are the consequences of whatever decision I make? And I think that it's the guidance, I think, that needs to be there for young people, because there's a lot of research out there and it's difficult to wage way through. It takes a long time. That's what we're there for. That is why I'm stating these things. I've looked at the research and considered and thought about it and weighed up, different, studies to say, well, which one would you think is accurate, or is it right on the point, or is it flawed, if you're with me? So I think that's difficult. But if parents actually go and look at what's being taught to their young people, I think that could be the first step on the way to guiding them.
Terri, I think that's a wonderful point to finish on. You have been watching Support Life. Join us again next week. Goodbye.